with us Sameer Patil from ORF, who is a celebrity in himself. Okay, so probably not, you're not directly knowing him for various reasons, but he's involved extensively and he's extensively involved at the global levels, and he works for ORF. So we'll take his views today. Thank you, Sameer, for giving your time. You have been always traveling, so difficult to catch you. Great. So we'll just start off with simple thing. Like, you come from a background where you see multiple industries across the globe. Okay, so it's not about insurance or banking or only India we're talking about. So from your experience, what do you think as a nation? Okay. What is our level of digitization? Of course, we are digitally, we are moving strong and among the better countries. So what would you like to say about the digitization levels, specifically in the BFSI sector, if you want to talk about?
So I would say, that India is certainly not a laggard when it comes to the digitalization and digitization both. I think the fact is that some of our industries have aggressively embraced digital technologies, and specifically talking about the BFSI, I think I'm not sure about the insurance and other those sectors, but I think certainly the banking sector has utilized the digital technologies. In fact, what I hear from many of the peers around the world is that the Reserve Bank of India is one of the most aggressive regulators when it comes to the digital technologies, both in terms of usage as well as in terms of protecting the consumers from the harms that cybersecurity or cyber frauds as well as the digital technologies may cause. So in that sense, I think we are certainly, I would say, one of the few countries in the world where we have both utilized the digital technology both for the operational efficiency as well as in terms of the expectations that today's consumers have from the companies.
Great. I like the word you use. This but typical my definition of differentiation of digitization and digitalization. I heard that. Why did you use that word?
So I mean, the fact is, that digitization probably has occurred many, I would say at least 10 decades ago. Because the fact is that, for instance, all our bank records, the KYC process and all that, has in a sense moved from the analog to the digital some time ago. But in terms of digital technologies, and here for instance not just the information technology, but looking at, for instance, cyber, looking at blockchain and those kind of things, we have seen an aggressive and ambitious adoption of those technologies by the industry. So that's why I would say that digitalization happened some time ago, but digitalization is where we are now progressing.
Great. That's my favorite statement. You have been involved with the national security level also, with the PMO's office and all. And you mentioned about greater technological advancements in a small nation like Estonia. I was reading your article. So Estonia must be having a population of just around 1.5 million. So maybe lesser than that. So when you're looking at our BFSI sector, okay, what would be your views on the cyber security aspects? Now, the way we see the cyber threats happening, of course, globally this is the problem. So I would like to know the specific. Of course, you're looking at the national security. So, do you think national security is also a threat, with the Prime Minister also talking about it in Mann Ki Baat, which is not a normal thing for a PM to do?
So I would say, so I think the fact is that the cyber threat landscape has got complex over a period of time, and the fact is that today you have the geopolitical rivalries spilling into the cyberspace, and that has really made the huge difference, because we had seen cyber crimes, we had seen cyber frauds happening when we had the small time criminals converting themselves coming into the cybersphere and committing those crimes, right? But what we are seeing now is that there is a persistent attempt by the adversarial nations to target each other by using cyberspace. Okay, and a couple of examples here. One is, for instance, the attacks on the critical infrastructure. Okay, critical infrastructure is something which needs to be operational 24/7. Typically, we think of the critical infrastructure such as, for instance, the power grids. Okay, or for instance, the nuclear reactors or the air traffic control. Okay, because any sabotage or disruption of these critical infrastructure will have devastating consequences, not just for the economy, but also for the national security as such. But the fact is that today you also have to expand the definition of critical infrastructure, and I would here actually include the financial services as a critical infrastructure, because, for instance, the way now we are dependent on our apps for financial transactions, or we look at the stock market transactions and those kind of things. Any sabotage, okay, deliberate sabotage of those financial services, the banks, or for instance the stock markets, will have catastrophic consequences. And we have seen, for instance, how the ups and downs in the stock market, can wipe out millions of rupees in a period of seconds. So I think, so that's one thing, that we are looking at, the attacks on the critical infrastructure. And here, we have seen a persistent attempt, for instance, from countries such as North Korea. Okay, North Korea has been involved in what we call as cyber heists. They are targeting the banks and the financial institutions to basically take out the money and then utilize it for the regime's own survival. Now, I specifically draw out North Korea primarily because North Korea is an example of how a country which has been made a pariah in the international system is utilizing the globalization, the dependence on information and communication technology, and the interconnectedness of globalization to actually advance the regime's own goals. Okay. One example, and I think you would see that being widely reported, is the heist of the Bangladesh bank from the New York Federal Reserve's account. That led to a heist of almost $100 million. Right? And come to think of it, that $100 million is probably a big amount. But the North Koreans were thinking even bigger. It was approved they were thinking of $1 billion transfer. It was just because there was some miscalculation in terms of the transfer that $900 million transfer did not go through. But $100 million transfer did go through, and then ultimately that money ended up in the casinos of Philippines, and then from there it was filtered by the North Korean regime. Just one example to say how countries are targeting the financial institutions to basically advance their thing. So attacks on critical infrastructure. The second thing that we are also looking at is in terms of ransomware. Right? Ransomware is something which is again basically targeting all those companies and locking their data and then demanding a ransom to unlock that data. And sometimes what we're seeing now is kind of a double penalty, which is that they demand $100 million, okay, you negotiate and you give $90 million. And because the extortionists are not happy that they did not receive the original amount, they would still also publish the data, right? Get the money and yet all publish all the data and put it on the dark web, right? So earlier, there was a feeling that if you pay the ransom, you would probably stop there.
We were expecting ethics,
right? But there are other ethics, so that's what is happening. So in terms of ransomware, but what we're also seeing is that again, state actors, adversarial state actors are utilizing ransomware to also advance their geopolitical goals and basically get the data. One example of it, and which has been widely noted, is the hack of the All India Institute of Medical Sciences in December 2022. Okay, initially it was pursued as a ransomware attack, right? But the fact was there was no ransom demand. Right? It was basically an attempt of cyber espionage, basically targeting the sensitive personal information of all the patients who utilize the AIMS facility, and we know that it is being used by the likes of Prime Minister and all the political representatives as well as the top bureaucrats. So attempt to get all that data, okay, under the guise of ransomware, right? So again, we are seeing a state activity, state activity by utilizing a tool which has been primarily used by the organized criminal syndicates. So these kind of things are making the cyber threat really.
So where does Estonia come into this?
So Estonia actually is one very good example because actually I talked about the splitting of geopolitical rivalries in the cyberspace. Estonia was one of the first examples of where it was hit by a cyber attack because there was a geopolitical dispute with Russia. There was a dispute in 2008 over the moving of a World War II era statue from the capital Tallinn to some other place. Okay. Now that statue was a representation of the Soviet forces. Right? And within Estonia, there are segments of the society who still, have very fond memories of the Soviet Union. Right? As against that, there are other segments of the population who believe that the Soviet period, the communist rule, was one of the worst things that could happen to Estonia. Right? So there was a debate which was happening, and the government at that time had proposed that as an expression of their antipathy towards Soviet Union, they wanted to basically move this symbol of the Soviet dominance from the capital Tallinn to move to something else, right? So, and Russia had actually protested against that, right? And what happened followed to that was a series of distributed denial of service attacks, DDoS attacks, which basically disabled most of the Estonian government websites, Estonian banks, Estonian television stations, Estonian parliament. Right? So that was the first example, one of the first examples of how geopolitical rivalries were being utilized to basically target the other nation states. And it was, even though it was, what should I say, there was not a complete evidence of the Russian involvement. The technical evidence did suggest that it was the Russian hackers. Okay. Now, whether that activity of the Russian hackers was sanctioned by the Russian state or not is a different story. But the fact is, that the Russian hackers doing this means, that they were actually, in a sense, taking some revenge for the shifting of that statue from capital Tallinn to some other place, right? So that's where Estonia comes in, and since then, Estonia has been very cognizant of this particular threat, and therefore has been advancing its cyber defense capabilities. In fact, after that particular attack, NATO also worked with Estonia to create what is called as a Tallinn manual, which is one of the few international, what should I say, agreements or guidelines, basically guiding states who become victims of the state-sponsored cyber attacks. So that's where Estonia comes in. And since then, Estonia has aggressively utilized the technology to basically secure its cyberspace as well as the digital frontier, and therefore is now very keen to work with other like-minded partners, which it believes can actually also benefit from its.
So is India also working on these lines?
With Estonia, you mean?
Not necessarily Estonia, protecting itself as a backup or.
Yeah. So I would say that cybersecurity has been a work in progress for the last 2 decades. In fact, if you look at the National Cybersecurity Policy, it came out in 2013, and now it is being amended to bring what is called the National Cybersecurity Strategy. So from policy, it is now becoming a strategy. So it's a much more active approach. We also set up a body specifically for the protection of critical infrastructure, because we also realize that there is a vulnerability of critical infrastructure in terms of cyber attacks or sabotage or disruption, and therefore we wanted to create a body which will work with the public sector, because our critical infrastructure spans both private as well as public sector. Right? So the government wanted to create a body which will work with both the sectors to establish certain baselines in terms of the protecting the critical infrastructure. So we have been taking these kind of steps for a very long time. Of course, as I say, that our efforts have to be 100% successful. But the saboteurs, they have to be successful only once, 1%, right? So that's always the cat and mouse game when it comes to the cybersecurity.
Absolutely. In fact, you may have heard about a couple of months back, maybe a few months back, about a year back, there was an attack on our subsidiary arm of the statistical arm of the regulator, the insurance regulator,
Right.
which has got huge database of all the insured lives.
Correct.
Okay. So it is about the general insurance, the health insurance, life insurance. The life insurance is wealth of data. It's financial, medical, habits.
Correct.
बहुत कुछ है इसके अंदर.
Correct.
So of course nobody knows the exact nature क्या हुआ है क्या नहीं, and of course now we have to rebuild everything. So how do you look at such things? Because it's a serious issue.
So
and we do not know how is it going to be used.
Correct. So what I have seen is that one of the major trends in terms of the data breaches is that the hackers who are either working out of the financial motives or being sanctioned by the state actors are targeting those entities which have centralized databases, because those databases act as honeypots. Because once you get access there, you can access wealth of data. And we have seen this activity both from North Korea as well as from China as well as from Russia. What we have seen, for instance, that the Chinese, for instance, now like this, I don't know whether in this particular attempt there was any attribution which was made to any of the adversarial state actor. But as I said, in case of the AIMS ransomware attacks, accessing that particular data, medical data, it's a valuable data, right? Similarly, what we have seen is, for instance, the Chinese targeting the guest reservation system of the Marriott hotels. Okay, their aim was what? Their aim was basically to go through the database and find out that who were the US citizens who had the highest security clearances. Because their research showed that the US officials always used the Marriott hotels for their stay. So obviously, Marriott had the database of all these people, and then by breaching that particular database, they were able to access that information. So if you see, for instance, it's like a jigsaw puzzle. Okay, the various pieces are your data pieces, and they bring the data. So if you put one piece here, you in a sense complete one part of the picture, and then you get other pieces through other data pieces to basically complete that picture. So that's how the Chinese look at when they look at in terms of espionage, in terms of spying and getting that access to data. That by targeting these different kinds of systems, you are basically putting in place those pieces of the puzzle, and therefore you hope to complete the puzzle.
Interesting. So, while we may be looking at A, they are looking at B and C.
They are actually looking at A to Z.
True. So we do not know where our data can be now being used at severe risk. And I think you made a very valid point of the centralized database. And now the banking, the insurance, everybody is trying to have a centralized database as the main thing. That's the only way you can actually get an integrated approach.
Correct.
So that means we are a much more severe risk. Okay. So when we talk about spoken too much of negative part of the cyber security, when we talk about this, the current world, the most abusive word I always say is AI ML. Okay, it's been used for the last 7, 8, 9 years. So AI ML, and now there's a new baby called Gen AI, right? So obviously blockchain is also there, Gen AI, predictive modeling. These are all words being used, and it's still in its incubancy phase. I can say that it's still going on. Where do you think as a nation we stand in this, and what do you think are the boons and banes of this?
So I would say, as a nation, I think we have, in a sense, understood the perils of too much reliance on AI. We have also realized, for instance, the harms which AI may cause, and therefore what we are saying is that we need to put some guardrails. Mm-hmm. Now, we may not have taken a very active approach like the European Union, which has actually put in place a regulation, the AI Act, right? But we certainly are espousing the principles which will ensure that the AI that is out there, is ethical and responsible. So we have, for instance, talked about the responsible AI framework. There are guidelines from the NITI Aayog which talk about these particular principles. We also talked about this particular principle during our G20 presidency last year, where Prime Minister himself at the G20 finance ministers meeting in Bangalore said that the G20 needs to make an effort to ensure that there is a responsible development of AI. And subsequently, that particular principle also found its way into the G20 New Delhi leaders communique in September 2023 after the G20 summit. So that means that we may not have taken a regulation-wise approach in terms of regulating this AI, but the fact is that we are talking about the principles, because we also realize, and probably it's a larger debate, as how do you go about regulating some of these technologies? Do you, for instance, go about creating more legislations and regulations, and therefore you will be always there in terms of the catching up with the technological advancements, or do you, for instance, talk about these broad principles which then can be applied to any situation which demands? Of course, there are again pros and cons of both the approaches, because, for instance, principles can always be violated, whereas the laws cannot be violated. If they are violated, you have a penalty, right?
And Indians unfortunately have the habit of, is there a law hai kya? If there's a law, I may or I may not do it, but if principle hai to
correct.
Like so, signal chalu hai nahi, nobody is there, I can go.
Correct. So I think it's an evolving approach, and we'll have to see. Fortunately, so far we have been. I would say that even though we have seen some regular reporting in terms of the harms caused by AI, we have not really seen the kind of what I call in the cyberspace as the cyber Pearl Harbor. Right. So I mean, I would say that it's a false hope, and probably it would be sooner than later that we'll see that thing. But right now we are hoping that this focus on principles will bring certain awareness amongst the AI developers that they need to be responsible. They cannot just say that they developed the code and it is the real world which is abusing it. Okay, they have to be mindful of the fact that the code that they develop will always be used for malicious purposes. Then what kind of guardrails you would build into that code to ensure that even if there is an abuse, that the end user will be protected.
So technically we are talking about ethical usage.
Yes.
So ethical usage, I don't think, at least I heard the Spanish government talking about that as a serious issue over there. But over here, I don't see anything like that.
Correct.
Last month, there was a change in the KYC guidelines and usage of PAN card and Aadhaar card data, or else it was used positively, but negative usage was also high.
Correct.
Right, all the open APIs was creating. Suddenly, we had to, the government had to come in and shut it down, saying that the servers cannot give, and it was instant. So probably maybe we may need some steps like that, because AI, the way it is used, like the digital arrest thing and other things, it's
Correct.
picking up. I didn't expect it to move so fast.
Correct.
The way the cloning part, the morphing part is happening, it's so faster on the unethical side. And if we don't have processes, probably we'll be in a bigger trouble.
But I think, certainly I think what you said is correct. But I think with the digital arrest, it becomes even more pertinent that the users or the people are aware that these are the kind of perils which are out there. When you
Victims are
exactly
lawyers,
right.
victims are
Right. So what does it show?
qualified
That
police
it
officers.
It shows that that people you expect that who will be aware of such a danger are actually the ones who are falling victims. What means it means that somewhere we have failed in terms of cybersecurity awareness, or what I call as cyber hygiene. Right? And I think that's a basic principle when it comes to any technology, right? In fact, I take it further and to say, it's something. There's a phrase which is called as digital civics. Which is digital civics. So in the civics in school, you learn about your fundamental rights in the Indian Constitution, right? But what we often forget is that with the fundamental rights, there are also fundamental duties, right? And somewhere our emphasis has been on rights rather than on duties, whereas both are 50-50, right? I think we need to replicate that, the fundamental rights and fundamental duties, to cyberspace and technology, which is that just because you are sitting in front of a device, okay, it's not like you are a faceless entity, okay? Your actions have real world consequences, and therefore you should be responsible in your own behavior, so that so that you are aware that what you do here will play out in the real world also, if you are not very careful in terms of what you do. Now, which means, for instance, simple things. For instance, would you, for instance, in the real world, give out personal information of your friends, right? Then why would you do that in cyberspace, right? What I call as doxing, which is basically that just because you are angry with someone or you want to take revenge, you would basically flood cyberspace with the personal information of that particular person. Or for instance, cyberbullying, right? The fact is that would you demonstrate such a behavior in the real world, going on bullying on people? You won't, because you know that once you start bullying, you will face the consequences, right? So why do you think in cyberspace you don't have the consequences? So that kind of thing, that be responsible in your own behavior, and hoping that it's like this, that the way you expect to be treated, you would treat others, right? Again, I would say probably someone can say it's a very idealistic, but I think that is how the human society has behaved. I think there is a case to be made for digital civics, that even if we achieve, let's say, about 50% of cybersecurity awareness, about cyber hygiene, about digital civics, I think the technological space would be a much safer domain than what
Does
we
this
are
exist
seeing.
anywhere in the world? Whatever nice things you said.
So the idea of cyber hygiene is something which has been translated to different aspects. So, for instance, in the European Union, because, for instance, they face a lot of disinformation and fake news from Russia, right? What they have done is that they have started to make their populations aware that this is what cybersecurity awareness means, and this is what you would expect when you look at a news site, that you would actually be confronted with all of this fake material, some of which is actually generated by AI, and therefore you should have your guardrails up when you look at such a content, to have a very critical attitude to the kind of content that you think is too good to be true, right? Something which goes against the mass belief, and if you see that, the first instinct should be not to trust it. Okay, question, and therefore ensure that even if somehow it suits your political beliefs, ensure that you don't spread it.
हमको तो forward करने का लगता है.
Correct.
We want.
And
There
which
was
is why
journalists.
then we add
India
a-
is full of journalists now.
And then you add a disclaimer to say forwarded as received, right? Which is basically to absolve yourself. You say कि मुझे तो forward आया था, I forwarded it. No, but that's not the attitude. You will only forward things which you think are genuine. And this is becoming a very difficult task, because now, for instance, with generative AI that you just mentioned, there is one assessment which says that in the next 2-3 years, 90% of the content on internet will be deepfake,
90%.
right? Which means we will need to instill this fundamental principle in the minds of the internet users that what you see there, you have to take a very critical view of it.
Very tricky question, I mean, because if you're saying 90%, that means if I'm living in a fake world,
Correct.
so how do I work for 10%? The 10% becomes the exception now, actually.
No, but that's the thing. So when you know that this is fake,
But
you would change your behavior.
I don't know. Well,
Right.
if 90% is going to be fake, so I'm going to live in a 90% world. It's like
Correct, but then
in Rome, be a Roman, bolte वैसा हो जाएगा.
correct, but then you also understand, that there are consequences of being a Roman, right? So either you be prepared that, for instance, if you, for instance, engage in creating a deepfake material, somewhere, you also will be end up becoming the victim of deepfake. So that sense of responsibility should be there, so that when you see that kind of content, question it, criticize it, and then see what you can do.
So I learned a new thing today. In Spider-Man, we always heard, with great powers come great responsibilities. So now you're saying with small gadgets come greater responsibilities. Nice. The world is moving towards the cloud adoption. In fact, initially people were banks and all, but now that is also accepted. Banks and insurance companies are also moving towards it. BFSI is heavily moving into this open architecture thing. What are your views on this? First of all, and how safe is this? And do we need any precautions to be taken? Data moving to other nations, do we see a bigger risk with the cloud? Because ultimately cloud, like specifically like US, China, Singapore, Korea, the mobile phones which we are using, okay, our fingerprints, our retinal scan, everything is there available. And even if we say that the banks, the RBI says that the server should be in India, but उसका processing अगर किसी AWS server या Azure server या Google server पे हो रहा है, even if it's fraction of a second processing is happening, I don't know how much sense would it say that you should retain the data over here. If processing is happened over there, it can also be retained over there. So obviously it's a belief like that. So what are your views on this? How safe it is, and how do we take, what precautions should be taken by the BFSI sector?
So I would say that cloud computing is actually a necessary evil. Okay, and I'll say this because, for instance, what we learned from the Ukraine crisis is that Ukraine had ensured that all of its data was on the Ukrainian territory, which means the servers were on the Ukrainian territory, and the Russians realized that this is a great vulnerability for Ukraine. So the first thing that they started was actually bombing these data centers, right? Which means cloud computing is an imperative, but that also means you don't know where your data is. So I think one thing that probably needs to be done, and I think which is where I think many of the countries are now moving towards, is what is called as trusted geography. The trusted geography principle basically means that I would store data on your territory, on the server on your territory, knowing fully well that I will get access to that data 24/7, and it's a reciprocal arrangement. That if today I want to establish a data center in the US, just to develop resiliency, so that tomorrow, if there is a cyber attack on my infrastructure, at least my data is secure there. I am doing that with the full confidence that I will get access to that data 24/7. Okay, and similarly, US also, will have that confidence that they will get access to their data 24/7 because the server is here. So that kind of bilateral agreements is something which many countries are moving towards. What is called as a trusted geography.
So who are the India's trusted geographies?
So right now,
officially?
Officially there is no definition. In the act it talks about the whitelisted geographies. Okay, and my presumption is, because I don't think any country has been whitelisted as of now yet. At ORF we do what is called as a tech survey. In the tech survey we ask this question: who do you think is India's preferred tech partner? And the list is basically the Quad countries. Okay, all the three Quad countries. US, Japan, Australia, then comes South Korea, comes Israel, UK, France. And
South Korea comes on the same one.
France and Germany, right? So there is a belief that these countries will, ensure some kind of protection and some kind of security when India is doing tech collaboration with them, right? So I presume that whenever this definition or whenever this principle of whitelisted geography is operationalized, these are the countries with whom probably will get. Now, there is a whole lobby of the US skeptics would say actually the US is the biggest data stealer, right? But then again, it's a necessary evil. If you cut off yourself from the US financial system, obviously then you'll have the consequences, and probably Russia is looking, is experiencing those consequences of being cut off from the international financial system dominated by US. North Korea has repaired. So what we have to do is basically not lose sight of your national interest, and at the same time utilize your ties with those countries to advance your interests. Now, other thing which many countries or many companies are also doing is what is called as zero trust architecture. Now, what is the zero trust architecture? And I think that is something which also should be and is being implemented in the cloud computing, which is that when you have so today, for instance, when you have access, when you have keys to a house, okay, the moment you open the front door, you get access to the entire house, right? That's a full trust architecture, that the person who has the key to the house can be trusted with the entire house. The zero trust model is that no, just because you have the key to the house does not mean that you get access to every room.
That's the house help when they come home.
Yeah, right. So to get to master bedroom, you need to have a different key. To go to another bedroom, you need to have a different key. You can probably access only the living room, right? Which is where you would not find that much of a valuable asset in any case. But master bedroom, or for instance the other bedrooms, you will have certain valuability, and therefore, in order to access it, you need a different key. So that's how the cybersecurity model is now being implemented, which is that the users or the entities which access the database, okay, once they enter the database, they can only access certain part of the data. To access other databases within that or other parts of the data, they need to have the key, okay, which is how you would have a zero trust model, because you're not giving access to the entire data. So something like that should be, because then it becomes difficult, because then you protect the data with all the encryption mechanisms and all that. So any hacker will confront multiple layers of encryption in accessing that data. So the US has now fully monitored the pattern recognition in its national cybersecurity policy in 2021 under the executive order, has mandated all the companies and all the government agencies to employ the zero trust architecture model.
So India is not on those lines as of now.
Not all the not everywhere, but some companies are, because they are compliant with the US regulations. They have to.
Tell me one thing. Suppose if, let's say, a bank, okay, I'm designing the architecture, the IT architecture of my company. So we have the BCP, DRP and all in place, obviously, right? So when we say, depending on the geography, we'll keep it in Hyderabad or other places and all, right? Depending on the opposite geography, you can say. So similarly, going by this idea of a trusted nation and a zero trust policy, let's say, okay, or would it make sense to have a data mirror or something like that in another country itself? Okay, of course, the regulation currently doesn't provide permit it, but maybe a smarter way of doing it. That is, the data is not directly accessible. It could be in an encrypted format, at least, so that the backup can be recovered, etc. Would it make sense? Am I talking sense?
Yeah. In fact, there are many countries which have utilized this principle. For instance, Turkey is one, which talks about data mirroring, which is that they will have a copy of the data on their own servers, but it will also be a copy of the data on other countries' servers. So that you have a backup. So even if either data becomes a target of a data breach, you still have access to the data.
Correct.
Right? So that data mirroring is one principle which is also, as has been suggested, also as one solution for getting over India's data localization principle. Which is to say, that okay, India is right in existing data localization, but that data localization should be combined with data mirroring. That even as you would ensure that there is a data which is there on the other country's servers, you will ensure that the data is also on your server. So in a sense, you are mirroring the data.
That's right.
Yeah.
So do you think RBI will, or an IRDA will, or a SEBI will permit this thing? Is there any talks going on?
I have not seen in the Indian context this principle. Even though many from the technical community have also suggested this as one of the approaches to be looked at when it comes to the data storage. The principle, the focus right now is because again, I think The reason why probably we are now insisting on data localization is also because we have seen the success of it, which is that that the RBI, when it mandated the payment data to be stored on the Indian servers, there are very few companies which defied that particular principle, and they were penalized. Mastercard, Amex, right? But most of the other companies complied with that particular principle. So the RBI also thinks that this is something which can be pushed to a certain extent, and which is why there is the insistence.
Google has not agreed.
Google has not. So which is why now there is also a shift in that approach, which is that we do a trusted geography model, where we agree that the data will be there on the other country's servers, provided we get access to it. Which is in fact one of the I would say one of the perils of the cyber criminal investigations. That when the law enforcement agencies want access to the data, they don't get access. In fact, there's a very famous case of a Kashmiri politician whose social media accounts the NIA wants access, the National Investigation Agency wants access to, because it believes that that particular politician aided terrorism. So they want the access to all the social media accounts of that particular politician, but all those are American social media companies. So that request has to go to the State Department, to these companies, and the State Department is blocked it.
Okay. So we are talking about, now we got the gold reserves back from the UK, right? So it was on similar lines where our gold was kept decades back over there on a trust basis that we can always have it accessed.
Correct.
So what we did to a physical asset, we need to do for the info asset, you're saying?
Yeah. In fact, I think
is ORF working on these areas?
So we have previously written. Not during my time, but my colleagues have previously written about this, talking about, for instance, US-India conditional data exchange agreement, which is that there is a certain kind of data can be stored in the US, provided India gets access to it. So at least the non-critical data can be put on the US servers, but the critical data remains on the Indian servers, something like that. In fact, there is a US-UK data exchange agreement which talks about these things, which is that both the countries have permanent access to each other's data on the data servers which are located within their territories.
So moving ahead, what do you think is the information security or the cyber security level or the data security of the Indian banks and insurance companies?
It's a mixed bag, because again, I think it's all the banks and the financial institutions realize and appreciate the significance of cybersecurity, but they may not have the necessary financial resources to invest in cybersecurity. Okay, that's one. Second, there may not be the awareness on the board about the cybersecurity practices. So right now, for instance, you have a chief information security officer, but chief information security officer only looks at the information security of the company. Whereas what everyone is saying, that we need to actually move from the CISO to actually chief cybersecurity officer, which makes the board understand that this is what cybersecurity means, and this is what we need to do. Right? So that's one aspect of the preparedness of the Indian banks. The other aspect is basically what is happening is that because there are many regulations, the effort of most of the bank is actually in terms of complying with those regulations rather than achieving true cybersecurity. Right? So we focus more on compliance than on security. Okay, and not to say that compliance is not important, but cybersecurity goes beyond compliance. Which is to, for instance, say just one very specific example. It can be, and you can accuse me of generalization. Which is, for instance, you say that if the RBI security guideline says, did you conduct a weekly cybersecurity awareness camp? Yes. Right? But the question is, how much of your staff is actually aware of the cybersecurity threats?
7 trainings done.
Correct. Right? That's compliance, and therefore cybersecurity achieved. Right? So there is much effort which is going in compliance than in terms of achieving the cybersecurity. That's one. And the third aspect of it.
But is it not true globally?
It's globally true. But also the thing is, when you talk of globally, we are talking about mostly of the countries in the West, okay, which have done some kind of financial investment in cybersecurity than the Indian financial institutions or banks. Right? And it's just a function of money. That I know that I am at a threat, but do I have the money to ensure that I can get protected from the threat? It's like, for instance, term insurance. That I know that my financial liabilities are actually extending to 3 crores, but my term insurance I can pay, premium I can pay is only for a 30 lakh cover. Right? So that's how.
मरना तो सबको है.
Yeah. So that's okay. So now that we talked about that, so that's the third aspect, which is basically many countries are actually saying we know that we will get cyber attack, right? So how do we cover it? We'll buy cyber insurance, right? Rather than ensuring that actually I take steps to protect myself from the cyber attacks, which is why now in the initial days of the cyber insurance, that is how most of the companies purchase the cyber insurance without actually implementing a basic level of cyber security. So now cyber insurance companies have realized that. So now they are saying you need to have X, Y, Z in place. Only then you will get a cyber insurance.
So technically, it's a red flag when you're not taking precautions. Insurance red flag.
Yes.
Great. Nice, getting a good view on it. Maybe one lighter question before we call it a day. Like the e-commerce is picking up like anything. Okay, now in fact the kids are also used to just making calls for food. So the e-commerce is picking up left, right, center. They are the blue-eyed boys. They are using technology. Insurance companies, banks. All of us are leveraging technology for various purposes. Do you think we are really leveraging technology for bringing on the best of customer service, making customers' life simpler? Okay, one is I'm leveraging technology to bring in operational efficiency or to make the flow better or cut down the layers of reaching the customer, whatever. But is it taking care of the customer's end? Because I'm making his life simple. Okay, whether a 70-year-old person today can enter this building without a QR code.
Definitely.
You are supposed, like you started off saying that a mobile phone is a necessary evil. So, is it necessary? You can't survive without it. Right? For banking is now compulsory on a phone. And tell me a bank which does not say that if you do not give access to your SMS and your contact, you can use the app.
Correct.
It's a literal official bullying and blackmailing. That means if you want to, you don't have a choice but to use map. If you have to use map, you have to give the data to me. Right? So if that is the level, are we really thinking of a best of customer service? Is customers' life made simpler? Like we are probably now in the last few years, I have started believing that it's difficult to reach the customer service department of any bank or insurance company or any of these aggregate apps. Is it true? Or am I feeling it?
No, I think there is a very genuine concern. Starting from the last point about talking to the bots. I myself have faced that kind of a frustration that I actually want to talk to a real human being than getting these very simplistic answers from the chatbot, right? And it's a feeling which has been shared by many people. That when they are in real distress, the first thing that they want to hear, just as a matter of human psychology, is a human voice rather than an AI generated voice or a chatbot. Who will give a very typical answer. So also on that front, I think the companies need to do a much better in terms of the customer relations. The other aspect of it, the talk about the banks getting access to the data. I would say that with smartphones, with electronic devices, the amount of data that you generate, has become multiple, right? But you go back to the analog days, okay? What you basically had a telephone number, a landline number, and a home address. And the principle was from the banks was the same, that unless I know your home address and unless I know your landline, I can't allow you to use the banking services because that is basic for me in terms of my operations, right? So the banks have utilized this privilege to basically now getting access to all this data and saying that listen, if I don't get access to your SMS, if I don't get access to your call logs, you will not be able to use my app.
And that means you have to tell me about your neighbor. You have to tell me about your friend staying in Australia also.
Correct.
So you have to tell me.
But again, I think this is where probably the more awareness about the privacy issues comes in, and I think the fact that that awareness about the digital privacy remains a big gap when it comes to usage of technology. And again, very simple example because we also discussed AI models and all that. How many people know, for instance, the fact that when they use the AI models, the information that they are entering to generate some output is actually not a private information any longer. Once you put it in the AI models, it becomes part of the AI model's own learning, and therefore becomes public. Many people don't know that, right? So that's what I'm saying. That kind of awareness, we really need to instill, which means we are still failing repeatedly in terms of the user awareness about these technologies. I started with a very basic example of cyber hygiene, but actually we need to again do these kind of awareness programs and awareness trainings over and over again, because technology keeps advancing, and therefore you need to bring those examples of those technological advancements to ensure that the user understands what he or she is doing.
Great. So my last question to you, Sameer. Where do you think our insurance and banking industry is moving? As a growth, as a digital part, digitization or digitalization part, as we say rightly, and on the security piece, and customer service also.
So it's a piece of moving this thing, because I think on one hand they're definitely making ensuring that they are working on putting in place some of these guardrails, because there is also a business case to be made for any kind of cyber fraud, that the cyber fraud may end up affecting the individual user or the individual customer, but as a brand, the bank or the insurance company will take a hit, because it's a reputation loss for them also, right? So they are taking certain steps to ensure that they are doing something on cyber security. So not just to protect their consumers, but also to protect their business. That's one. But I think in terms of the usage of some of the technologies, they have also realized that the more access they get to the user data, the more they will be able to monetize it, and therefore so that's why this perennial search for more and more consumer data. So which is why you would get these stupid questions from the bank saying please, besides the basic financial listing, it would say for instance how much do you spend monthly? Why does my bank need to know how much I spend on a monthly this thing, right? But bank has to know my annual income, because it is for their compliance purposes, that, and for the money laundering and those kind of things, they need to have information about that. But next to that, if you put a question, many users will actually enter something. A user like me who is aware that this information bank does not need to know, actually will put some false figure there. So I think on some of these technologies, I think the banks and the insurance companies have really gone overboard, and probably again the regulator has to step in here to say I think the digital data protection bill act in a sense tries to address some of these issues, but the question always is in terms of enforcement. That how do you enforce that?
GDP talks about consent. He's saying I took the information for the customer. No.
Yeah.
So I did not steal it. I asked it, he gave it.
Yeah. So I think the enforcement remains a big loophole in many of these issues.
Great. Hey, thanks for your time, Sameer. It was nice. In fact, that's quite some different learning also. That digital world is not different from the physical world, and the war part of it is this thing.
Yeah.
Thank you for your insights.
Thank you so much.
It's a pleasure meeting you.
Thanks.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.